Good afternoon. Today I want to talk about or begin a discussion of, and maybe even come close to the end of the discussion on the legislative branch. But before I do that, I want to hark back to something we said last time, which dealt with the notion of surveys. And I was cautioning you about the way one takes surveys and how to interpret them. One of the things I did not say, but should have said, and which fortunately is in the text, much depends upon the way a survey question is posed. In surveys, much, if not everything, depends upon the way the question is posed. If you ask a sample of the American population if they are in favor of gun control, then something like 80% plus will say yes. If you ask that same sample, are you in favor of a national gun registry, which means that every time you buy a gun, your name goes on a list, and you are on a list as possessing a gun, the number would drop dramatically. And so there is oftentimes a bias in the way in which the question is posed. That's why reputable firms, reputable pollsters, and so on, and what I learned in college was, you go over your questionnaire time and time again until you can recite it in your sleep, and you constantly try it out over and over and over again. The problem exists, and it will always exist. So, for our purposes, whenever you see a report upon a survey, if it's a reputable survey, they will always say, respondents were asked, and tell you exactly what it was. Then you can use your brains to figure out whether or not there was a bias in that or not. So I want to just leave you with that. Let's talk now about the legislative branch. It was supposed to be the first branch, the most important branch. The Constitution begins with a discussion of the legislative branch, Article 1. When I was in school, in graduate school, I should say, we talked about the fact that America was in a process of transition from one kind of government to another kind. We used to speak of what was called congressional government, where the agenda was set, the rules were set, according to the House and Senate, of course, and constitutionally in every way, but the center of gravity in the entire political legislative process lie within the House of Representatives and the Senate. The executive was essentially an implementer. With World War I and with the Great Depression, and then with World War II, and what is the civil rights movement and things that we've talked about ever since, we have been moving from something called congressional government to executive government or presidential government, and some people sometimes even say imperial government. I don't know if that latter is true, but if you should ever hear it, then you'll know what I'm talking about. The reasons, I think, are simple. Just as federalism has changed, and just as concepts of rights and liberties have changed, so too the demands made upon our political system have changed to the point where the Congress is simply too big, too unwieldy, lacking in centralized leadership to put together an adequate response to the problems that are perceived to exist in our society. The executive branch, as we'll see next hour, can do a better job of responding more rapidly, more effectively, and in a more targeted manner to deal with issues. We are now in a process of, or a period of presidential government. We have moved away from congressional government. Back in the old days that even I think I can remember, a budget, a national budget, was drawn up in the Congress. Nowadays, the Congress wouldn't think of drawing up a budget. They would simply wait for the executive to submit a budget. Congress would not expect to come up with a foreign policy. They would wait to hear various propositions and ideas put forth by the executive before they did that. And so, as I say, the center of gravity, the control of the agenda has shifted from the Congress to the executive. We have moved from congressional government to executive or presidential government, and that's one of the first points that I wanted to make today. Secondly, what do we mean by the term Congress? Originally, the term Congress referred to both the Senate and the House of Representatives. All were members of Congress. Then, for reasons I do not begin to understand, though I think deep down they are connected with snobbery, it was felt that somehow senators outranked representatives, and they referred to them not as representatives but as congressmen. And so if you were a congressman, you got a lower seat at the table than did a senator. If you were a congressman's wife, you got a lower seat at the table than a senator's wife. So Congress, in some cases, refers to members of the House of Representatives. I'm an old-fashioned sort of fellow, and when I use the word Congress, I'll use it to include both Senate and House of Representatives. Member of Congress, that means either a representative or a member of the Senate. The next thing I need to say is that we have the notion that our representatives are supposed to represent us. And there are two theories about that. One is the representative as a delegate, which is to say, we elect or appoint someone to go to Washington and do what we would do in what we want him or her to do, what we tell them to do. In other words, they're really little more than talking dogs. They speak for us. That's one concept. The second concept is representative as trustee, which means that we bring someone to represent us, we find someone to represent us, and we have confidence in their judgment, and we realize that if we were where they were and saw things from their perspective, we might very well vote the way they vote too. So we have that notion of congressman as delegate or as representative. Whether you pick one or the other doesn't touch the fact that, generally speaking, American members of the Congress and the Senate do not represent the population of the United States in descriptive terms. Our Congress and Senate are overwhelmingly white. They are overwhelmingly wealthy. They are overwhelmingly better educated. If you can imagine sort of just taking a slice of our entire population and taking the upper part, these are the people we elect to represent us. There are many reasons for this. Now remember, what I said was the Congress and Senate do not represent us descriptively. In other words, demographically, there's a difference. If our population is 30% of color, the Senate is not 30% of color. They do not represent us in that sense. Substantively, however, of course, there is representation. The point I want to make here is that we need to see the legislative branch and its membership as an elite. We need to see them as men and women who are called to a profession. Traditionally, it was thought that the members of the Congress and the Senate would be called to duty, and they served in Congress or the Senate as a matter of duty. You didn't go there to get rich, you went there because it was your duty to do so. What I'm arguing now is that there's been a change. Membership in the Congress or in the Senate has become a profession. And like all professions, it has its norms and its requirements for success. The object of the congressman and the senator, in fact, is to get reelected. And in order to get reelected, there are certain things that people must do. So let's just recapitulate. The Congress does not do what the founders thought it would do. The Congress is not descriptively representative of the American population. The Congress is not populated by men and women who are called there by a sense of duty, although many of them undoubtedly are. The Congress and Senate represent professionals who have their own standards and their own desires and things that they need to do in order to get to where they want to go. The unit of concern to the congressman is the constituency. The constituency. Most of us think of the constituency as the guy in the chair at the Capitol and then the folks back home. In other words, my congressman, whom I've known forever, the family I've known forever, we talk, we do various things. It's a one-to-one, very personalized relationship. And that's true. That exists. But we must also remember that constituencies also include interest groups, groups of people who share the same and have common interests. So a congressman represents not only the folks back home, but he represents farmers as a block. He represents fishermen as a block. He represents pharmacists as a block and grocery wholesalers as a block. You get the idea. The idea of constituency has always had a personalized component to it. What I'm trying to suggest is that component must be broadened out to include the fact that there are any number of interest groups within a constituency. When a congressman comes down in favor of a particular issue, he is responding not just to fishermen who happen to live where he lives. He's responding to fishermen who live in Alaska or in Virginia or on the Gulf Coast or somewhere else. So constituency has a kind of national or trans-state or trans-district kind of meaning as well. Which leads me to the next point. We talk about districts. Obviously, the district for each senator is his or her whole state. Congressional districts are very, very different. Congressional districts are decided, or the boundaries for congressional districts are drawn every 10 years, because we have a census every 10 years. And by law, each block or each district is to comprise about 435 to 465,000 people. Back in the beginning, it was 30,000 people or 25,000 people. Therefore, one of the most important things that can happen is drawing the boundaries of congressional districts. If you been reading the newspapers, as I know you have been, you are aware that on Tuesday the Supreme Court heard a case from the state of Wisconsin, in which it boils down to the fact that the Democrats received over 60% of the vote and got 48% of the seats because of the way the districts were arranged. That's an example. Now, this process of setting district lines in order to give partisan or racial ethnic advantage is known as gerrymandering. Gerrymandering. It's in your book. The story is there was a man named Elbridge Gerry, who was, I think, from Massachusetts. And he's a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He's a signer of the Constitution. He was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention and held office. And in fact, his state designed a congressional district that looked something like this, down, around, and up and around, and everything else. And all the wags, enemies of the time, said, "What is that? Is that a salamander? Is it a snake? Is it a salamander?" And the story goes, said, "Nah, it's a gerrymander." And so that word was introduced to our language. Get used to it, because we're going to hear it more and more and more as time goes by. Gerrymandering is a major problem. As a definition, gerrymandering refers to the setting of congressional district boundaries in ways that give a particular advantage to one particular party, that's known as partisan gerrymandering, or one particular race, that's known as racial gerrymandering. Now, how does it work? Suppose you have, if a census shows that a particular state is losing population, then it sees a reduction in the number of its representatives. If a state is gaining population, it gets an increase in the number of its congressional representatives. Over the years, New York used to have the largest congressional delegation. Now, I think Arizona's might even be bigger, because there has been that movement of population to Arizona. And of course, California is likely to be where it is until it slides into the ocean at the next earthquake, when one never knows about these things. So that is the example of the different kinds of gerrymandering that we see. Now, there are attempts to deal with this issue. The way one might go about this is, let's say that you had a city with a large portion of Democrats, and the Democrats moved whatever, and it came time to redraw the boundaries. You might take this one area with lots and lots of Democrats and split it into thirds and divide it with others. So 1/3 of the Democrats could be paired with an area that has got 2/3 non-Democrat, and thus you've effectively nullified the existence of that particular group. You get the idea? Or you could do the reverse. You could simply take areas where there are large numbers of African Americans and match them with areas that have smaller numbers that also have, you can dilute the effectiveness of that concentration of African Americans. Now, the government has tried to deal with this. This comes directly, or goes directly, to our previous discussion of civil liberties and civil rights. For $2 billion, what is the constitutional provision? What is the constitutional provision or provisions that are most relevant to gerrymandering. I can't hear you. Yeah, that's right. It's the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment and the 13th Amendment. That's where gerrymandering becomes an issue of politics, because it becomes an issue of rights. It becomes an issue of liberties. The problem is, how does one know what are the criteria by which one proves that there has been a deliberate attempt to gerrymander? There are none. We have tried in certain ways. In the 1960s, it was very, very easy. When you had a county in North Carolina, or you had a county, I know some counties in New York State, as a matter of fact, where gerrymandering was an accomplished fact and everybody knew it. And it was possible just to take a census, just to look out and see, and there it was. But there have been some formal efforts made. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Voting Rights Act of 1982 together made it illegal, made it the burden of each state to show that they were not gerrymandering for political or racial purposes. The burden was on the state to prove that it was not doing it. Also, states with a history of segregation and voting rights abuses and all of these things, for that, read the Old South, had to receive the permission of a federal court before it could change before it could change its districts or the way it drew its districts. I hope we're communicating on this. In effect, what happened was the right to draw district lines, which, by the way, constitutionally is in the states, not with the national government, was severely constricted by the intrusion of the national government. Now, depending on your political view, on your ideology, and all of a bunch of other things, you can say that's either good or that's bad, but it was a fact. In 2016, the state of North Carolina petitioned the Supreme Court, to say, look, our record here has been very bad. It's gone all the way back to the 1800s, and we're not very proud of what we've done. But we worked very, very hard to right these wrongs. And we're now at a point where we think we've demonstrated that we can be trusted to do the right thing. And we should not have to ask permission every time we want to go and change our rules. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, you're right. Now, that applies to the state of South Carolina. In North Carolina, we still have issues, and we have issues in other states as well. I think what I'm getting at here is this. All I can do is try to explain to you what gerrymandering is, why it is important, and then say it is likely to be with us forever. It is never, ever going to go away. If the Supreme Court rules in favor of those who question the drawing of congressional districts in the state of Wisconsin, which we won't know about probably until June as to what their decision is, but if they rule in favor of those who complain, we can expect a tidal wave of similar suits in courts all over the country. It is no longer going to be a north-south issue. It's going to be a national issue. And let me suggest why. You've all heard, I think, of Karl Rove. Karl Rove was President George W. Bush's major advisor, one of his major campaign advisors. And it was his idea as follows. Let me give an example. When I was a little boy, I used to walk to school. And on the way to school, there was a gas station. And the owner of this gas station put in a pinball machine. I don't know if you all know what a pinball machine was or is. It's just you pull back a spring and it shoots out a ball and it bounces off various things and you have flippers and you can keep it going and do all that kind of stuff. And until our parents and teachers found out about it, we kids used to stop there and play pinball on our way to school, on our way home from school. And we learned early on, being kids and being the way kids are, that if you took the pinball machine and just lifted it up a little bit, the ball behaved very, very differently. It didn't roll in expected paths, it rolled in other ways. And we racked up scores of 500 points, 1,000 points, 2,000 points. I mean, we would just wish we could have, converted that into chocolate bars. We would have been happy as clams had we been able to do that. That's what gerrymandering is. In effect, it is an effort to lift up that machine, that pinball machine, and cause the ball to roll in other ways. Back to Karl Rove. Karl Rove had the idea that what Republicans should do was to concentrate upon elections at the state and local level and to win majorities in state houses and government mansions, thereby gaining the capability, the capacity to control the drawing of congressional boundaries. And was successful in doing this, which is the origin, if you like, of the Wisconsin case that I've talked about. Now, we all know Democrats would never do anything like that, right? I mean, we understand that Democrats, unlike Republicans, are totally honest and would never, under any circumstances, engage in anything that even remotely resembles gerrymandering. Ha ha ha. All right. I gotta say the ha 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 because I'm afraid some of you might take me seriously and then I could be in big trouble and I'd rather avoid that if I could. That was intended to sound sarcastic, which it was. It simply underscores my point that gerrymandering is going to be with us for a good long time. And it raises fundamental issues about democracy and representation and all of those things. So we've tried to deal with it through the courts, and if you've been watching TV, you've seen former Governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, on, who was talking about what California and 5 other states have done to deal with gerrymandering. They have promoted and created independent commissions that report to no one, that are beholden to no one, who simply meet pretty much in secret, although they have to publish what they say and what they do, and they set those boundaries. So far, what I'm going to call the California solution or effort has been the most effective. And I would be willing to predict that in the wake of the Wisconsin decision, which we should learn about in the spring, we probably will see more in the way of the development of independent districting commissions. You may have noticed, our talk today has been, it's like I'm kind of firing a shotgun, going from point to point. Have you ever heard the term gridlock? I dare say you've heard the term gridlock. What is gridlock and what causes it? Where does it come from? There are two theories. One of them is the political sciencey, social sciencey, very jargony, oh so frightfully educated point of view, which says that gridlock is the result of the responsibility versus responsiveness dilemma. I say it again, responsibility versus responsiveness dilemma. You will not find this in your you will not find this in the text of your book, and therefore you might very well find it on the next exam. But that's to be determined. The responsibility versus responsiveness dilemma. Representatives and senators have to respond to their constituents. Very often, what their constituents want may be in conflict with larger notions of the common good. Okay? The result is representatives and senators do nothing. Now, again, I'm not calling anyone out for partisan purposes, but this is all in our minds because we saw it on TV yesterday. Speaker of the House, Ryan, was asked about legislation in the light of what's happened, of the tragedy in Las Vegas. And he said, well, we need to talk about mental health, we need to talk about these kinds of issues because that's really where the problem is. That's gridlock. That's an example of gridlock. Another example would be, well, President Trump. Well, we shouldn't talk about it now until we get the facts. Speaker Ryan is right. President Trump is right. But it's also a matter of gridlock. It is an example of gridlock. The responsibility versus responsiveness dilemma. Another view of this goes to something I introduced a couple of lectures back. Remember when I talked about identity politics and I talked about how we create these subjective realities, and we talk about intersubjective realities and so on? The fact of the matter is, and this is what we talked about when we talked about why Americans are divided. We said they are not divided on the basis of ideologies so much as they are on the basis of incompatible, shared, subjective realities. We have gridlock because we simply cannot agree on particular things, because these things go to the core of our identity. Now, I realize it sounds a little bit silly, but as a former gun owner and as a former member of the NRA, I can attest to the fact that my ownership of firearms was important to me. It was part of who and what I was. I taught my sons to shoot, and I taught them to hunt. Fortunately, they're much better than I would ever be. But that was a part of my identity. And so when you talk about banning guns, or even a national gun registry, that resonates with people like me, with my own subjective reality, okay? So I guess what I'm suggesting here is that a second reason for gridlock is because we have incompatible identities and we practice identity politics. Now, this is a point at which I would usually stop and say, are there any questions? If there are any questions, maybe you'd email them to me or put them up on the question board or do something of that sort, and I'd like to continue. Let's talk more specifically now about the House, about the judicial branch. There are four principles that inform, that underlie, that give rise to, that help us to understand the way our legislature works. They aren't very complimentary. They certainly aren't in the Constitution, but they are a function of how our institutions and a lot of other institutions work. The first thing is we might call universalism. Our Congress, House and Senate, work on the philosophy that public goods should be distributed as widely as possible. Remember we said ages ago that politics is the process by which a society decides how public goods are to be distributed? Part of the answer to that is they are to be distributed as widely as possible. When the Army or the Air Force, when the Department of Defense has to acquire a new fighter aircraft, it wants to be certain that the company it hires is going to have offices or factories or plots or whatever throughout the country. General Dynamics may be located and may be headquartered in Texas, but it's better to have factories in Georgia, in California, in Montana, everywhere. The idea is to spread everything around. It's not a bad idea, actually, when you think about it. So, when we say, what's Congress going to do on this issue? Ask yourself, well, it's going to spread stuff around. What's that mean? Again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just the way it is. Something a little less bright is the concept of log rolling, which comes down to you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. If you'll come along and support my bill on quotas on red snapper, I'll support your bill on logging redwoods in California. Log rolling. The third and the most important thing we hear most about is something called earmarks. Now, obviously back in the old days, as I understand it, farmers would mark their sheep or their goats or their cattle by taking a notch out of the ear, or making a mark on the ear of their animals, hence the term earmarks. It used to be, and still is, possible for a representative or a senator simply to put into a bill a requirement that so much money be spent on a particular project. For example, suppose you wanted a bridge over the Neuse River on US 70. And you had one, but it was 2 lanes, and you wanted 4 lanes. Well, you could simply slip into a bill a provision that $5 million or $700,000, however much, would be allocated for the purpose of doing that. Which is to say, money would be appropriated and especially earmarked for particular projects, always which redounded to the benefit of the district. Another term for this is pork barrel legislation. This got so bad and became so out of control that the House and Senate themselves limited earmarks. Let's just say they are gone, but not forgotten. If you're interested, I can say more about how we deal with it. But do you see how this relates to the requirement that congressmen and senators service their constituencies? Do you see how it relates to the need for casework, the need to respond? Because that is what enables congressmen and senators to be reelected. Now, the fourth concept I want you to be aware of is seniority. I've got a son who's an airline pilot, and we were talking when he first joined up about his prospects as an airline pilot. And he said, Dad, you just don't understand. If you want to be promoted in the airlines, all you have to do is be around. Seniority is everything. That's not quite true in our Congress, but it's reasonably true. That the longer you have been around, the fact that you've been around a longer time entitles you to, you may deserve it as well, but it entitles you to a larger role, a kind of supervisory role. If you're going to be chairman, if you want to be chairman of an important committee, the longer you've been in Congress or in the Senate, the better your chances of being appointed to that position. And so it goes. All right. This is difficult for me to express in a way that's terribly coherent. But what I'm trying to say is that in the DNA, so to speak, in the genie of our legislative branch, there are four sort of ways of behaving. And let's talk about them as universalism, spreading things around, log rolling, scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, earmarks, getting special attention for problems at home in the constituency, and seniority. Okay? Now, I suspect that if you spoke to an individual senator or congressman, they would say something like, "Oh, well, I don't believe in earmarks. We have rules that say, seniority is not the most important thing," and so on and so forth. My response to that is, yep, okay. They are with us. They will stay with us. Now, we've reached the point where I've sort of talked around the House and the Senate. And I really want we really do need to get into the more formal structure of those institutions. Can we stop here for a minute? Okay, now let's talk a little bit. We've talked mainly about some of the informal structure and the informal aspects of the House and the Senate. Let's get slightly more formal. The details of this are well outlined in your text, and I'm simply going to try to go through them and give you a guideline as to which are the more important things and things that you should focus on as you go along. I know it seems hard to believe, but the United States House and the United States Senate are well-organized institutions. I mean, compared to the British Parliament, compared to even the Italian Parliament, I think we do pretty well. Okay, they are well-organized, each in their own way. As you might expect, because it's larger, because their terms are shorter, there's far more turnover. The House is more tightly organized than the Senate. There is less room for individual representatives to maneuver, to play, I mean that in the best sense of the term, in matters of policy. Whereas in the Senate, where the terms are for 6 years and senators are around for a much longer period of time, they get to know each other better. The rules are very important, but they're more like conventions than formal rules. There's more slack, and senators have more prerogatives. That's the first thing. And that was intended, by the way, by the founders. The basis for the organization in both House and Senate is provided by the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, the parties. It is the parties who organize the House and the Senate. Party membership, where you stand in your party, is a very important predictor of where you might stand in the House leadership and in the Senate leadership, and vice versa. Your standing in the House leadership or Senate leadership contributes to your position in the party. But by position, I don't mean formal position, I mean your reputation, your influence, your ability to bring people around, your ability to use seniority to your advantage, your ability to do some back scratching, your ability to do all of these informal things that we have talked about. So there is a one-to-one, mutually reinforcing relationship between party standing on the one hand and standing within the House or Senate on the other hand. Let's talk first about the House, because that, I think, is in many ways the more interesting of the two houses. Talking about the House, the leader of the House of Representatives is known as the Speaker. The present Speaker is Congressman Paul Ryan, a Republican. The Speaker of the House is the head of all of the members of her party in the House. In the House. Not the head of his or her party, but the leader of all the members of his or her party who happen to be members of Congress or members of the Senate. It is a partisan position. Usually, the Speaker, as I've said, is not the chairman of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. Party leadership, as we'll find out later, is a kind of conventional thing, or conventual thing, where the president has a role and the vice president has a role, and there really is no one party leader. But the Speaker certainly is a power in his or her party. The Speaker is elected by the whole House. One of the first things the House does when it meets is elect a new Speaker. And generally, as a rule, Republicans, it's a foregone conclusion that whoever is the head of the dominant party is going to be the Speaker. There are occasionally some futile attempts to unseat it, but that does not amount to very much. The power of the Speaker is considerable. It may be, in many respects, the most powerful position, certainly in the Senate, certainly in Congress, and maybe even in Washington. Why? First, because the Speaker plays the major role in assigning members of Congress to various committees. We'll talk later about the committee system, but for now, let me just say that the work of the Congress and the Senate is done in various committees, and some committees are more important than other committees. The Post Office Committee is not really very important. The Intelligence Committee is very important. If you were a congressman, which committee would you rather be on? You'd rather be on the Intelligence Committee. Well, that will depend in large measure upon your relationship with the Speaker, who will be instrumental in making that decision. So, one source of the Speaker's authority is his or her ability to influence, if not actually decide, which members are going to be on which committee for what time. Again, more about that later. Secondly, the Speaker sets the calendar of business in the House of Representatives. He decides what proposals will be considered, when they will be considered, whether they will be debatable or undebatable, whether they will be amendable or non-amendable, how long the debate will continue. Which is to say, nothing can happen to any proposal, or whatever happens to any proposal or bill, is the result of a direct decision by the Speaker of the House of Representatives. It makes a big difference if we have a bill on gun control, for example. Now, can you imagine what would happen if the Speaker tried to say, well, this is what we're going to consider. We'll consider it for half an hour. Each side will have 10 minutes to speak its point of view. We will not accept any amendments and move to an immediate vote. Can you imagine what would happen? So then you get some sense of what the power of the Speaker really is. In effect, insofar as the House of Representatives is concerned, it is the Speaker who sets the priorities. Now remember, we said months ago, politics is the process by which a society decides who's going to get what, when, where, and how. Politics is a policy that represents the authoritative allocation of values. What decisions are going to be made about who gets when, where, how, authoritative allocation of values, that whole program is fixed by the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Actually, the House of Representatives, the Speaker of the House, should be in many respects the most powerful man in town. Because he's the head of the party in the House. And if people don't do what they want him to do, what he wants them to do, then he can get at them, he can demote them from within the party, he can do a whole lot of things. Does that make sense? I'm sure you're all nodding your head. But you're also asking, well, if that's the case, then how come they got rid of Speaker Boehner? And you're probably saying, it doesn't seem to me as though Speaker Ryan is actually very powerful at the moment. We haven't heard very much out of him in the last 6 weeks, or the last 6 months as far as that's concerned. So how could we say the Speaker is so powerful? I'm going to weasel out of that one. And I'm going to stand by everything I just said about the power of the Speaker. But I'm also going to say that the Speaker position is affected, along with everything else that we have talked so far about, is affected by the existence of identity politics or conflicting shared concepts, shared identities. Okay? Before, the Speaker used to be able to say, if you don't come along with us on this, or if you fight me publicly on this, then I will use my power to deny you the nomination to run again. And the Speaker could do that. But now we have identity politics, and people don't run as Democrats or as Republicans. They run on the basis of their identities. And so a congressman can say, well, that's fine, Mr. Ryan, or that's fine, Mr. Boehner. You can say that's fine, but you know something? I don't really need your endorsement. And in fact, your endorsement may work to my disadvantage. So I'm going to do what I want to do. Now, if I have made that point, then I think we have a window into understanding what's wrong, if I may use those terms, with our government at this time. in fact, the basis for the authority. I said before that the rules were terribly, terribly important in the House, and the Speaker controls the rules. And congressmen and women have incentives to follow the rules. But now, members of Congress don't have the same incentive to follow the rules. They are free to act more independently in ways I don't think the founders had in mind or could even conceive of. And so instead of seeing, we don't have a Republican Party. We don't have a Democratic Party. We'll talk about this in great detail later. We have a couple of parties that go by the name Democrat or Republican. I hope I have made that point clear. And note, please, it is consistent with the theme of the course that I introduced on the first day, that our politics in America are in a process of evolution and change. This that I have identified today, spoken of you today, is one of the major ones. All right, we've talked about the role of the Speaker. Now, under the Speaker, we have the Majority Leader. He's the most senior member of the party. And we have, under the Majority Leader, we have something called whips. The House uses what is called the whip system, W-H-I-P, whip, whip, whip. And that's exactly what it's meant. It's meant to whip the man into shape. It's a British term. Speaker, Majority Leader, Minority Leader, whips are each assigned to look after, to follow certain members of Congress. And or they are assigned to take the pulse of the membership of Congress on critical issues, gun control, education, vaccinations, whatever. They're supposed to know what's going on all the time. Speaker, Majority Leader, Minority Leader, whips, organize. They have their prestige as a result of their positions, but also because of where they stand in the party. Now, it's really not much more well, it's a lot more complex than that. But what I've just said should give you some way to come to terms with the way it is organized. Now, so far we've talked about majority. The minority party has a majority leader, the minority party, has a minority leader. That's Senator, at the moment, Senator Chuck Schumer of New York. And a minority leader as well. We'll talk more about those jobs later on. But for now, I just want to sort of point you in that direction. Okay. We understand that in some respects, the House and Senate have been homogeneous. A theme of mine has been they are growing less homogeneous. Different numbers of congressmen and senators will meet formally and organize themselves into what they refer to as caucuses, groups of men and women who are interested in the same subjects and have lots of things in common. Our own Congressman Matthews is the leader of what is called the Freedom Caucus, which is a group of very senior, very conservative Republicans who are adamantly opposed to anything that even smacks of Obamacare. They're the reason Speaker Boner, I used to do that as a joke, and then it just became sort of reflexive with me. Speaker Boehner, my apologies to the Speaker and to any of his relatives, if you happen to be related to him. Speaker Boehner, they caused him to resign. They withdrew their support. Unheard of in American history. We have blue dog Democrats. We have the Congressional Black Caucus. We have the Hispanic Caucus. We have the Law and Order Caucus. These caucuses have no standing in law. They have no standing in the rules of the Senate or anything else. They are informal groupings. But they represent centers of opinion, centers of thought, and they reinforce each other, and they provide certain divisions within the organization. So, I think that's probably pretty much what I want to say at this point, is that as much as I want to say about it. Well, next time we'll get into committees and a whole range of other things and say more about the Senate. But I would like to leave you with, I guess, two things. You constantly hear the term conference and caucus, and it's very, very confusing. I get mixed up with it all of the time. Generally speaking, Republicans have conferences. Democrats have caucuses. Whenever the House or Senate Democrats get together as a group, they are a caucus. When they are caucusing. Whenever the Republican members of the Senate or the House get together, they are conferencing. Okay? Except you have to realize that there are also a bunch of other meetings going on, which are also informally referred to as caucuses. Now, I really wouldn't waste a lot of time trying to figure out what's the difference. Just know that the House Republican Conference refers to a meeting of all the Republicans in the House. The House Democratic Caucus refers to a meeting of all the Democrats in the House. And the Senate Republican Conference, all the Senate Republicans, the Senate Republican, I'm losing it, the Senate Republican Caucus refers to all the Democrats. Okay? I think I got that right. I'm going to leave you with this and reinforce something we said earlier. Why is it that congressmen and senators are able to defy, or at least to make the leadership work hard to get them? Why are they independent in ways they have not been before? There have always been congressmen and senators with strong bases, always. There have always been congressmen and senators who could shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue and still be reelected. I'm not saying this is something new. But never before in our history has it been such a generalized, common phenomenon. I believe, and I put to you for your consideration, you need not accept it, but I ask you to think about it. I put to you for your consideration the fact is that we are now dealing with what I refer to as identity politics. Thanks. We'll talk more about the Congress and Senate next time.